Hey, Cam Dunlap here with a quick video about what buying and selling millions of dollars of Beanie Babies taught me about real estate. And I'm not kidding. I bought and sold millions of dollars in Beanie Babies between the end of 1998 and probably 2000, early 2001. So it was just a skosh over 2 years. And if you'll recall, this was back in 1998. If you'll recall, Beanie Babies were really popular back then. Collectors were grabbing them and paying top dollar for them. They were in short supply, and it was an interesting time. And I kind of tripped over it, actually, the opportunity, and then seized it. Little background, I was at a real estate seminar that I was teaching. This was years ago, of course, and I was in, I think, Dallas, and I was there with a couple other people who were co-teaching with me, so I had some downtime, and I was just walking around in the hotel, and in another meeting room, they had this Beanie Babies show going on with all these dealers with tables and racks behind them with all these beanies, and they were all for sale, and you know, you could trade them, sell them, buy them, whatever. And so I walked around thinking, yeah, these are kind of interesting. I heard a little about them. Maybe I'll buy a couple for my not yet born daughter, Nicole. My wife was pregnant at the time. And I thought, you know, maybe they'll be collector's items. So I went in and started looking around. And I saw a gentleman behind a table, obviously a dealer, who looked very, you know, intelligent and very well dressed. He had a gold Rolex watch on. And I thought, man, what's he doing here? So I went over to him and I asked him, I said, so what is it about these Beanie Babies? And I'll never forget, he leaned forward on the table like I have in front of me here on his knuckles, and he sort of leaned into me and he said, son, you have no idea what you're looking at. And I thought, okay, you've got my attention. And he started telling me about the business, a little bit about it. And so it was a couple weeks later, I was home and I went to a flea market near where we lived in Florida at the time. And there was, you know, all kinds of stuff, this huge flea market, all, you know, new stuff, used stuff, junk, you know, good stuff. And there was a dealer there who had a booth, and up in the back behind her, up on a shelf, were these brown bears with the Union Jack, the British flag, embroidered on their chests. And I asked the dealer, I said, what's the story with those? And she said, oh, those are only distributed in England, and so you can't buy them here in the US. And I said, well, how much are they? And she said, $200. And I thought, that's kind of a lot, although I had heard of some being much more expensive, but I thought that's a lot. And I didn't buy one, but I went home and I started looking around on eBay, and I found a dealer in England who had a dozen of these Britannia bears, they were called, Britannia, sort of like Britain, and had a dozen of these bears for sale for $1,200, so $100 each. And I thought, well, that's a lot of money to send to you know, England to a complete stranger. So I reached out and we talked a little by email and then on the phone, and I got comfortable, and so I sent him the money and he sent me the 12 bears. I then turned around and listed them one at a time on eBay. I was an early adopter. eBay was pretty young back in 1998. And I started selling these things for more than $200. They were going for $225, $250, $300, and I had paid $100 for them. And I thought, oh my gosh, I've discovered something here. So I went back to my friend dealer now in England, and I bought a case, or what is 9 dozen or 108 units. I just continued selling them one at a time for, you know, $250, sometimes over $300, because the demand was there and people were bidding these things up. And I said, wow, this is interesting. Well, then the guy in England called me and he said, hey, there's some beanies that are distributed only in the US that I would like to sell here. Could you go and find them for me? Here's what they're called. Here's what I can pay for them. And I said, sure, I'll go do my best and find those for you. And I, you know, looked and sort of created some relationships, and eventually weaseled my way into a whole network, a national US network of these dealers. And there was an old online sort of bulletin boards environment then called Sportsnet. And I joined Sportsnet. And so I could say, hey, I'm wanting to buy these and I can pay this. And someone would fill the, they'd call me or they'd answer and say, your order's filled. And there was a lot of trust there, and it worked out really well. So I started buying more exclusive British beanies to sell in the US and buying exclusive US beanies to sell in Britain. So then it made sense for me to actually go to England and meet this guy and some other dealers that I had gotten friendly with. And that I learned was a very good thing to do because, most people won't go and visit and do the, travel and do the work. And I was willing to. I learned from my dad a long time ago that, business is all about relationships, and face-to-face, you can't beat it. So I booked an airline ticket and a hotel and learned how to drive on the left and went to England and met all these dealers and really strengthened those bonds, went out to dinner with their wives, partied with them, It's nothing like a little alcohol to lubricate a situation and help, relationships flourish. And so started buying and selling just literally thousands of these things. And one of the ways we did it that was interesting is we would trade. So instead of sending large sums of money, internationally, and this was pre-2000, this was pre-9/11, right? So we could have done that. We still could do that, but there's a lot of fees, and then exchange rates vary. And what we did was we just agreed on an exchange rate at the time of the transaction. So my dealer would say, well, I'll give you 30 of these for 75 of those, and that's at this many dollars US. So we always kind of talked in terms of US dollars. So I'd send him the box and he'd send me the box, and we'd never really exchange much money. The money got exchanged primarily here in the US, where I would sell on eBay or at shows. I traveled around to some of these shows and got to know a lot of the dealers that way, and literally bought and sold millions and millions of dollars of these things. Now, what I learned from these about real estate, I'm going to share, and I'm actually kind of hinting around it now, but I'll share in a minute. But I want to tell you one more story, and this really sort of typifies the whole point. Ty Warner was the name of the man who owned the company Ty. They're still in existence. They still make Beanie Babies today. And he had a huge ego, and they finally reached, I guess, $1 billion in sales. And so he threw a party for his executives. There were 80 or 90 of them there. And he had a very unique bear made, and with coloring and embroidery and the tag. And then he signed the tag, and he called it the Billionaire Bear. And he gave them to each of the people at this party. And so there were about 80 or so, maybe 90 of them total in existence in the world. And the tags, the little heart-shaped tags, were all hand-signed by Ty Warner. Well, I had a friend who had a friend that worked for Ty in Northbrook, Illinois, who was at that party, and she got hers. And then she later on went around, and some people had left them. She picked up a couple more. And so he made them available to me for $10,000. And I was like, whoa. I'm not touching that until I know I have a buyer. Well, I went to my English guys, and they went around and shopped to their biggest, most, willing to spend collectors, and literally sold 2 of them at $35,000 each. So I bought 2 for 10 and sold them for 35 each. So spent 20, made 70, and $50,000 profit. But now this, transaction that large, I actually decided I was going to go to England and deliver them. It was a good excuse to go back, and then I would collect the money and bring it home, and I did. And I came home with $70,000 in US dollars in cash in my suitcase, my rollerboard, going through security. Can you imagine doing that now in the world we live in today? I mean, once 9/11 came along, I mean, that was going to get you pretty much thrown in jail, and you'd have to prove yourself innocent. But it was no big deal then. So I did that, and I did it with a few other bears. But that $25,000 was the highest single profit that I made on any one beanie. I got very close to that on a bunch of others, but. So here's what all of that taught me about real estate. I discovered that it's true, it's been said by a good friend of mine, and it's absolutely true, that it's easier to find a house for a buyer than it is to find a buyer for a house. So effectively, you find out what your buyer wants and then go get it. you find out what your buyer's willing to pay for it, and then go get it and buy it for less, and then provide it to your customer. In the case of wholesaling houses, our customer is a rehabber or a landlord or both, and we either through a relationship or through our cash buyer data feed or investor buyer data feed, you can go and find these buyers and see exactly what they're buying and exactly what they're paying, and then go find them what they want. So I learned from Beanies that it's easier to find a house for a buyer than a buyer for a house. Because what I was doing was finding a beanie for a buyer or a box of Beanie Babies for a buyer before I ever committed to them. So I basically had them pre-sold before I ever committed to buy them. That was a big lesson. And then another lesson was that I discovered, carrying that concept to real estate, the easiest way for me to find a house that my buyer wants and buy it for less than what he or she is willing to pay, the easiest way to do that, the most direct way with the least amount of effort, was vacant houses. So I would know what my buyer wanted. I would go and search every vacant house I could find, make offers on them, and then finally, find one that fit the need and mark it up and make my profit. And that was ultimately how I began wholesaling, was with that same mindset. But the solution, what made it work, was not just randomly looking at houses. It was specifically looking at vacant houses. And because if you think about it, every vacant house, with the exception of someone's second home in a vacation community or something, every vacant house is a representation of a problem the owner has. Because you've got vermin, vandals, and vagrants that are all preying on the house. You've got an insurance problem. You might not know this, but if you have a vacant house with a homeowner's or a landlord's policy, and that house is vacant for more than 30 days, there's a pretty good chance your insurance is not actually covering you. They would exercise their exclusion in the policy. Read your policy. More than 30 days of vacancy, and you're likely not covered. So, every vacant house represents, just on its face, a problem, and at least that much motivation on the part of the owner to get rid of it or occupy it, certainly. So that was a big discovery for me. Then the other thing that I learned from buying and selling millions of dollars in Beanie Babies that translated to real estate was that I became comfortable with making large sums of money. And for some people, they never get comfortable with that, and therefore they never do. The idea of making $30,000 on a single transaction that didn't really take a whole lot of time, certainly didn't take you, if you make $60,000 a year, it certainly didn't take you 6 months to do it. And so you have to get comfortable with the idea of large sums of money without what you would anticipate the kind of output that would require that. So I got very comfortable with that. I made $25,000 I made $50,000 on 2 Beanie Babies, and there was very little work involved. So the concept of making large sums of money and that being normal and okay and part of my everyday became a reality for me. And and here it is, more than 20 years later. And that I look back on that as a real eye-opener lesson for me, because I had a little bit of a worthiness issue, I think, like many of us, and that cured it. That absolutely cured it, and I just basically translated beautifully to real estate. By the way, while I was doing this, I was buying and selling houses, and I was out teaching seminars periodically. At the same time, I was doing this Beanie Baby business, and then it went. And it ended just like that. And by the way, in this building, I have a box of just the very few that I got stuck with when the music stopped. It was a bit like musical chairs, and the music stopped. I got stuck with one box, and what I have invested in that box, probably maybe $15,000. But over the course of that, just about 2 years, I made almost $1 million in profit. And I looked at the 15 grand in that box and thought, meh. So what? And I still have them, And every now and then I'll go on eBay and take a look at what stuff is trading for, and they're up somewhat over the, you know, when they collapsed, but not much. And so that's my story. That's that's what buying and selling millions of dollars in Beanie Babies taught me about real estate. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you soon. Take care.